Welcome to Sovereign Finance, the show that connects the dots between personal finance, global finance trends, and deep human history. Tune in every week to demystify the money puzzle and protect your interests in a turbulent world. Hi, this is Rob Drummond. I'm your host of the Sovereign Finance Podcast. I'm here with Derek Dearden. How's it going, Derek?
It's going great, thanks, Rob.
On this episode, we're going to demystify the money puzzle, because I think money is one of those things that should be quite simple on the face of it, but actually it is a bit of a puzzle. And I wondered if you could share the story that you were telling me earlier about the child mining tokens.
When our son was a toddler, in the village there was a group of young mothers who took turns to look after each other's children, and they had a system to keep it fair of tokens, which were simply washers about a centimetre across that they used. Each token was something like looking after one child for 1 hour or something like that, so that they'd keep a balance between them. And when somebody joined the circle, they were given a starting dozen or so of these, and they'd swap them out. And the idea was that when anybody's tokens were running low, they'd realise that it was time they looked after a few other children in return, and built the stock up, and it kept it balanced. And after a while, they slowly began to notice that there was one member of the group who was parking her children quite a lot around the others and didn't seem to be taking them in. And eventually somebody confronted her, and she admitted that she'd simply gone to the hardware shop and bought a bunch more washers and was using these.
She'd inflated the money supply.
Exactly. And it's not even entirely clear. I mean, I was not directly involved in the conversations, but it's not even entirely clear whether she was deliberately malicious or simply somewhat naive and hadn't really grasped the idea. But I think that this is an illustration of two things. First of all, that at the root, one of the functions of money is to enable an exchange of value, as they say. But that at the last resort, the exchange of value comes down to an exchange of productive work on the part of one party and on the part of the other. And that doesn't always have to be on a one-to-one basis. We can look at the way that it probably developed in various historical societies in a bit more detail later. But the other point that it illustrates is that within that system there have always been people who either deliberately or unconsciously try to subvert it. There are people who want to actually have the spending power of more money without actually delivering fair value for it. And we'll look at all of the kind of ways that we do this. And the other point is that I was going to say it's a metaphor, but it's actually slightly more than a metaphor. It's an exact equivalent of what the people who have been managing the money supply certainly for the past several hundred years, and possibly going right back into antiquity, have actually subverted it for their own ends and are continuing to do so. And in the present time, this situation is now running out of control, and we'll look at how that's evolved and how it's likely to play out from here.
I think it illustrates as well that money can be anything. It can be washers, as long as everyone agrees on the value of a washer, which I think is why gold was used in the first instance, because we could all roughly agree how much a certain amount of gold is worth.
Well, the thing about using gold is that it's got various qualities which make it extremely useful. One is that it's intrinsically attractive in its own right. Another is that it doesn't rust or oxidize or degrade or rot in any way. And another is that there's not a very great deal of it in any particular society at any particular time, or even in the world as a whole. And it takes a great deal of effort to expand the amount of it. But as you say, all kinds of things have been used. Shells have been used, tobacco leaves have been used, and as we know, silver and copper have also been used, these being the principal metallic elements that were available in the ancient world. But the most common form of money in almost all societies over the past 6,000 years has actually been grain. And all over the country and all over the world, there are tithe barns, large and small. And if you look at some of those, some of them are almost as magnificent as cathedrals. The people who built those didn't think that the kind of society they were living in was going to pass away anytime soon. And each of the local farmers would have to bring a certain proportion of their harvest and deposit it in the tithe barn. The lord of the manor obviously wasn't going to eat all that grain himself. He would himself use it as a medium of exchange to pay his retainers with and to trade with artisans in return for the work they did for him. And also the farmer hopefully would have enough left not only to feed himself and his family and his workers if he had any, but also to trade with the other artisans in the village community. And so that was the major form of money over most times over this period of human history. And it wouldn't necessarily be on a one-to... Obviously, the grain represented the work done by the farmer and his family and his team over the course of the previous year up to the harvest. It wouldn't necessarily be on a one-to-one basis that he would trade that with other operators in the village. An hour of his time, if you average it out what it took to produce that grain, might be traded for half an hour of a blacksmith's time or a miller's time, and it might be traded for a small fraction of an hour with the local doctor.
And we still do that today, don't we? Because if you get paid a certain amount per hour and then you go and hire a marketing consultant who charges you $1,000 an hour, then you're exchanging a lot of your time for a little of theirs, as long as that's still... The question is it still fair? Is that still a fair exchange, I guess?
Well, I'd say the answer is that sometimes it is, sometimes it isn't. And any time it's not a fair exchange, it's yet another form of theft. And essentially, there are two ways of acquiring money, if you like. One is to create something of value and exchange that thing of value for a sum of money, and the other is to steal it. And that form of theft, that theft can take many forms. The simplest one is obviously to simply grab it when people are not looking, or to threaten them with violence or even murder them. And there are many, many more subtle ways. And what we'll be looking at is some of those more subtle ways that are in operation. Because over the course of my lifetime, I've really seen the amount of value that is necessary to accumulate in order to simply survive through the next month change dramatically.
And that's if we, I guess that's a theft of your time as well.
It is.
But I think, I guess money is necessary for any civilized society, isn't it? Because you're going to have artisans, you're going to have specialists, so you're going to have to trade. So, like, you can't go back to, say, a barter economy, because if you're bartering chickens, and those chickens are going to have different value to different people, and it maybe works on a one-to-one basis, but it doesn't work on a bigger level.
There's quite a debate over whether the idea that originally we operated by barter and then money was invented, that's a kind of oversimplified explanation. Not everybody agrees with it. Probably there was simply an informal exchange of operations without people keeping track on it, and with a general idea of fairness. And it's quite interesting that, in fact, although there's been, particularly since the Thatcher-Reagan era, a strong conversation that human beings are basically selfish and self-interest and pursue their own interests, and that we need all these mechanisms to keep track of that. In fact, human nature, I would say, is much more benevolent than that. One of the things that enabled the success of the human race was the fact that they did cooperate, that they did have empathy for one another, they did support the sick and the wounded, that they also were not prepared to tolerate people who violated those canons of trust and respect. And if you go back to before the settlement on the land, to the hunting gathering thing, anybody who didn't cooperate with the band and look after the band as a whole was likely to be exiled, and then they would genuinely have a solitary and short, lonely existence. And it was only after settling down and developing agriculture that groups of people arose who thought, well, rather than going to the trouble of growing this food, I can simply move in there and steal it. And we'll trace the development of that and see how that led over time to local warlords, and then to kings and emperors, and now to the people who are not quite so visible, who are ultimately the dominating characters in the world that we live today.
I wondered if we could just go back and so thinking about money and the classic definition. So what
the standard textbook definition is that what money is it's a unit of exchange, a means of exchange, as a store of value and a unit of account. And in a way, the second two really depend on the first. And I'll just go into a bit more detail of what those actually mean. And there's also another meaning which is kind of in the background, which is also related, which I'll come to. So the medium of exchange is pretty obvious. If you're making violins and somebody else wants to buy a violin, he might not have something that's the value of an entire violin to give you in exchange for it. So he can do a lot of transactions with various other people using his skills and his time and effort. He can accumulate this medium of exchange, then he can give it to you, and in turn you can get the food you need, the house over the roof over your head, and anything else you need, without necessarily finding somebody who provides those things who happens to want a violin. So that's pretty straightforward. The store of value is the fact that you might have accumulated some of this, and you don't necessarily want to exchange it for something else right away, but you want to be able to exchange it for something else in the future. And we can look at all these in the examples of the the farmer and the grain. And then the unit of account means that I might have something that you want now, and you don't necessarily have the whatever is being used as money right now. The farmer might need a new set of horseshoes from the blacksmith, and it's now June, and he won't have the grain to pay the blacksmith with until the end of August. So he can make an arrangement with the blacksmith that he's going to give him 1 sack of grain or whatever it might be in return for 4 horseshoes, but he won't do it now, he'll do it then. And that obviously is one of the derivative things. And what I would say is that the final use of it is, I would say, as a unit of measure, which is obviously related to these things, but it's to answer the question, is this operation as valuable as that operation? Or have I done as well in my business this year as I did last year? The interesting thing about it as a unit of measure is that it really depends on the fact that there is some kind of standardization. If you go to the grocer and you say, I'd like a kilogram of sugar, or if you go to the draper and you say, I'd like 2 meters of fabric, it would be ridiculous if you came a week later and you said, well, this doesn't look like quite as much fabric as I got last month. And the draper said, oh no, the meters have got shorter in the meantime because of inflation. I mean, incidentally, that's one of the sneaky ways that inflation, and inflation is actually a misnomer. I'll come to that later. It's really, in the terms that it's used mostly today, the real word would be debasement of the currency, and we'll look at that in more detail later. But obviously, you expect a meter to be standard, you expect a kilogram to be standard. And ultimately, I mean, these days there are complex scientific definitions of these units that are based on the laws of physics as we best understand them. But historically, there has been a standard somewhere. And in the case of the meter and the kilogram, they were a platinum rod and a platinum ball, which were kept in a museum in Paris. And periodically there would be what were called substandards, which is, it doesn't mean defective in the way that substandard normally means, but it means derivative standards that were maintained by other standards bodies, and they'd periodically have a kind of ceremony when they'd go and compare them. And then the weights that you put on your scales in the kitchen and the ruler that you get from the builder's merchant would ultimately be able to trace their lineage back to those standards. And for most of the time, that has been the real role of either gold or silver, in that these have been the standards by which it was eventually defined. And in fact, when I was at school, the Bank of England, we had pound notes then, because pound was sufficiently valuable to be worth more than a coin. But each pound note had written on it, I promise to pay the bearer on demand. Each pound note still had written on it, I promise to pay the bearer on demand the sum of £1 in gold. And the teacher pointed out that this was actually not true and hadn't been true since 1933. And one of the boys said, so why is it worth anything? And the teacher said, well, if you like, you can give yours to me. and he was an extremely lazy and obnoxious teacher. But what he said there was actually had the germ of the reality of the situation, which is that the pound note carried its value because somebody else was prepared to accept it in exchange for ultimately their labour.
Wasn't the British pound effectively the reserve currency of the world earlier in the century as well?
Right up until 1914, and in fact, it's quite interesting. We'll probably go into this in more detail in another conversation, but and this touches on to the creation and destruction
because
of wealth.
They needed to debase it to finance the First World War, presumably.
That's right, and in fact, Winston, it came off the gold standard right at the beginning of the war, temporarily. Winston Churchill, who was Chancellor of the Exchequer, attempted to put it back onto the gold standard in 1925, which would have been a good idea had he been prepared to accept that the rate of exchange with gold had shifted. Because when it was put back on, it was actually worth less than it had been in 14 because of the waste and the destruction of the war. And that's a topic that we'll come back to, and it's obviously particularly pertinent in the chaotic situation in geopolitics right now. Because of that, there was a huge run on the pound. Lots of people in other countries wanted to present their pounds and take their gold away, and they, in order to try and bottle this down, the British government attempted to reduce the wages of the workers to keep our exports competitive, and that resulted in the general strike, and eventually they admitted defeat. Took it off the gold standard, I think, in 1932. And we'll go into those in more detail because that was really the point at which the dollar became preeminent as a reserve currency because it was still based on gold, although Roosevelt had to devalue the dollar in terms of gold at around the same time. And then after the Second World War, Britain's currency went down from around 4 to the dollar to 2.8 to the dollar, and of course it's continued to go down ever since. There was a period of stability for around 20 years after the war, but now currencies around the world are spiralling out of control downwards.
I think there's still a perception that a pound coin or a £5 note, like I was talking to my dad a while back, and he said two things. He was like, he was convinced that there was actually a sliver of gold in it somewhere. I was like, I don't think there is. And he was also fairly sure that he would be able to exchange it for an amount of gold. And I was like, no, I don't think you can. I think it's made up.
Well, you can always buy gold with a pound, but True. You don't get very much. You get, I think, around 20 milligrams for your pound these days, whereas it was 8,000 milligrams before 1914. And it had been for 250 years prior to that. It had been completely stable.
This has happened before, though, with the Romans, for instance, hasn't it? And their coins getting smaller and smaller and smaller.
Yes, yeah, exactly. I haven't got the exact figures. I meant to have them, but when we do our session deconstructing the phenomenon of so-called inflation, we'll look at that in detail. But it happens at every single empire. While the empire is at its peak, the currency is stable, and then one of the things as the empire unravels is that the currency has less and less and less buying power. And this is happening at a faster and faster rate. The Romans maintained their power for a great deal longer than the British Empire, and the British Empire has maintained its power for a great deal longer than the American has so far. And really, if you look at the preeminence of the American empire, and it is an empire, although it pretends not to be, that lasted effectively from 1945 to 1972, when Nixon took the dollar off the gold standard. And although it has remained the world currency, its status as that is highly questionable now. And we'll be looking in more detail at the implications of that and the way that might unfold for the rest of the world. And you may like to draw some conclusions about the strategies that you may like to draw some conclusions about the strategies that you adopt to see yourself through this turbulence, which is plainly already starting.
So what we're saying is that the money in your pocket isn't connected to a standard amount of gold. It's, I mean, most money is kind of digital now anyway, which is here or there, but it's numbers on a screen. So it doesn't make sense. Beyond your immediate liquidity needs of paying bills and so on, it perhaps doesn't make much sense to have huge deposits in a cash amount because it's going to be debased.
I should perhaps re-emphasise that we're not offering financial advice.
Yeah.
Not a professional, if you can find an honest one. But yeah, how to store whatever value we may have accumulated is one of the puzzles that we have to unravel between us.
We'll talk about Bitcoin and crypto in a future episode, but I wanted to touch on it here. Like, how does something like Bitcoin differ from a fiat currency like the British pound? Because in essence, like, you know, we kind of do have digital currency already in the fact that a lot of transactions are digital. But I think it's night and day, and I wondered if you could explain why.
Well, I think we need an entire episode on that, and I think we will be probably giving an introductory exploration between us, and then we'll look for some experts who've got more specific knowledge. But effectively, all of these blockchain technologies, of which Bitcoin is the founding example, rely on the fact that it's a write once, read only ledger. It's a ledger which is publicly checkable. Effectively, the money that you have in the bank is stored in a ledger which the bank has access to, and nobody else does. So the idea of central bank digital currencies is an attempt to obscure the fact that what they would like to do is to keep control, which actually defies the whole object of a blockchain technology, because as we'll see when we go into it in more detail, it takes a very great deal of computer power to create a new block and add it to the blockchain, and a relatively small amount of computer power to check that the blocks more than 10 minutes old or more than an hour old are valid. And therefore, multiple people all around the world are keeping track of it. And that, I think, is the key difference. Does that make sense?
It does, yeah, it does. And we'll dig into that in a future episode. I think as a major takeaway then, I think there's a difference. Like, a lot of the examples we gave earlier were to do with tradespeople or farmers. And I think there's a big difference between how working class people or tradespeople, people who exchange time for a service, or people who produce something or provide something. I think there's a difference between how we use money and how the people who control the money supply, use money, and perhaps that's something to start thinking about and trying to understand. Great. Well, on the next episode, I'd like to dig into inflation a bit more. There's a perception that inflation is actually desirable, that it's an indication of economic growth and the success of the economy, and it's just inevitable. And
well, there are two conversations about inflation, which are both, in my view, entirely bogus. One is that it's something that we have no control over, and it's just like the weather, and you just have to put up with it, and there are people there looking out for us and doing their best to ameliorate the situation. That's a complete fabrication, and we'll explain why. And the other one is this idea that there's a target rate of inflation which is 2%, and this is conducive to optimizing economic growth. And there's a whole can of worms there. In the first place, there's no objective justification for that proposition at all, and yet it's been repeated so often that people accept it. And that's one of the features of the way that the human mind works. If something's repeated enough times, it comes to be accepted as a fact, even if there's no foundation, there's no logic to it, which there isn't in this case.
That's the nudge unit at work.
Yeah. And the other thing is the idea, which is another whole topic in itself, that economic growth is the be-all and end-all of improving the human condition. And we'll deconstruct that, and we'll see how fallacious that is, and how, even if it were true, it wouldn't be possible.
Good stuff. Well, we'll talk about that next time. Thank you for listening. Catch you later. Bye. Thanks for listening to this episode of Sovereign Finance. For more episodes, transcripts, in-depth articles, and the community, please take a minute now to subscribe free at sovereignfinance.substack.com. See you next time.